Hello, welcome to my presentation from universal communication to mediated communication. I have shifted my presentation a little bit, and T&I really comes as mediated communication now. I will first show you a little overview of what I'm going to talk about. As a first point, I will talk about key concepts and their interdependence. First of all, of course, the universal communication concept by Karl Jaspers, which I will use and throughout the text. Second, mediated communication as part of universal communication. And third, translation and interpretation as the practical arm of mediated communication. I will then talk a little bit about the interdependent methodologies. These are, of course, very few and do not do justice to Jasper's concept at all. But there are first common concepts with regard to three phases of the communication processes. In the universal communication, mediated communication T&I paradigm, I will second talk about the role of explicitness and speaker opinions, which Jaspers formulated, and what we call individual hypotheses, and lastly, give a comparative coherence of text example, German and English. Universal communication, according to Karl Jaspers, is talks about the concept of grenzenlose Kommunikation as a world philosophy. That means a borderless communication within our world. He, and I quote him, he says, all languages include an untranslatable world, which is nevertheless translatable to a certain degree. This apparent incompatibility may lead us to think of the principle of linguistic relativity and language philosophy. Humboldt thought that language is the expression of a nation's spirit, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and would therefore lead to untranslatability. Karl Jaspers offers a new perspective to this philosophical debate by projecting the potential for a universal communication. He calls it in German, die grenzenlose Kommunikation als Weltphilosophie, and considers this as a basis for peaceful understanding and communication beyond national borders, by suggesting to place more emphasis on the opinion of speakers and hearers when trying to understand each other. Jaspers' thought is reflected in the later linguistic differentiation between language as a system and texts or discourses as language in use. Text is understood as a number of utterances connected by sense continuity. The linguistic term for sense continuity is coherence. Discourse is understood as a communicative text in dialogue form, requiring sense continuity, involving language use and interaction. Both text and discourse imply Jaspers' opinions of speakers and hearers in terms of his central concepts of ciphers and transcendencies, as Jaspers calls diese Chiffren der Transzendenz. Universal communication and mediated communication, how do the two interrelate? No one can speak all the world's languages. Jasper's understanding and communicating beyond national borders, therefore, presupposes mediating communication. This means that mediated communication is pragmatically part of universal communication. Being part of universal communication means that mediated communication encompasses the conceptual thought and methodological principles of universal communication. We can here only briefly touch two of these methodological implications relevant to mediated communication. First, the explicitness, hearer-speaker opinion paradigm, which is operationalizable as individual hypotheses, and second, the three-phase process principle. Universal communication presupposes human understanding of other languages and cultures, and therefore is dependent upon mediated communication. But while UC aims at human understanding for its own sake, that is, peace and worldwide tolerance among people, practical translation and interpreting, by definition, serves the purpose of making understandable what his partner or the partner says to other partners. TNI's purpose, this is the definition of TNI, is to make a speaker or hearer's message from one science system to another science system understandable for other speakers and hearers for a specific purpose and under specific conditions. This includes the sign language as a language. Mediated communication practically involves a transfer in at least two cultures, languages, modes, and or science systems, which need to be known from one text discourse to another, as well as text discourse production between source and target culture, language, mode, and or science system, requiring comparisons and reformulation according to a set of parameters, which are normally purpose, norms, recipient type. And these need to be specified for any individual scenario. Both text and discourse need to be understood as coherent, which requires cultural, language, and world knowledge, inferences, and we call them individual hypotheses. This practical dimension of mediated communication is referred to as translation and interpretation. And what you see here is actually the communicating a message, M1, via a mediator or interpreter. It is not going as usual from A to B, but through the filters of an interpreter. These filters are the interpreter's understanding process, his or her world knowledge, sympathy, or empathy, and his or her anticipation of what B is able to understand. So instead of going from A to B, the interpreter in between needs to be conceived as a person whose understanding process and whose anticipating process requires hypotheses and assumptions, and it's not just fact. Both concepts, again, universal communication and mediated communication, imply three phases in bona fide communication. First, recognizing, understanding the other, the text, discourse. Second, comparing what is shared among the communicative partners, the texts, and what is foreign to the other language or person, language, value, mentality, culture. And as a third aspect, which is very interesting, struggling for truth. This is an inherent concept in universal communication by Jaspers, and it means that despite all the understanding that we can come up with in understanding the other, we need to remain to ourselves, within ourselves. And applied to translation and communication, this is the struggle, or can be interpreted as the struggle for the right word in mediating. While Jaspers describes his enlightening existential communication in philosophical terms, MC establishes operationalizations in terms of concrete action formula for the understanding, transferring, comparing, and reproduction processes along three interdependent text dimensions. These are available as translation methods in detail as spectra, holantra, and relatra. It follows the rationale that by embedding a provisional understanding of a word into a wider context, we develop an understanding of its contextual meaning, a meaning of a word in context, and an even deeper understanding by integrating speaker opinions as hypothesis of the interpreter or translator, and of making them available, transparent to others, making them visible. TNI as a practical dimension of mediated communication implies that when translating or interpreting, we automatically include the opinions of speakers and hearers, this is Jaspers' term, in the process of establishing sense by coherence. The term coherence is understood as sense continuity involving inferences. This is how Bellot calls it, who introduced the term into linguistics. World knowledge, as Debergrandi Dressler called it in 1981, being identifiable by thematic and semantic continuity. If we cannot identify a thematic or semantic continuity in text or discourse, then we rely on hypotheses, which act as indicators of coherence. Because hypotheses may vary from one person to the other, we call them individual hypotheses. They can be made transparent and distinguishable from explicit utterances by using topic maps, semantic networks, that is, connecting possible separate islands, which is shown in the following graph. Again, this is done by the frequently published relata method. The following graph shows two networks, one completely connected network around B, and a second little topic map around A, which is not as stringent as B is. The two are themselves completely coherent with each other, but not connected with, A and B is not connected with each other. So we can see, if we interpret these as topic maps of texts, we can see that the network around B is a much more important network, and the other little network around A is a second network or second topic. So this text taken as a whole has two topics, B and A. We can now connect these two networks maybe connect these two networks by individual hypotheses, linking each of the little relations of A to any concept in B, to any relation in B, which would be an individual hypothesis, and it would be distinguishable by a different color or other signs. For translators and interpreters, it is essential to differentiate facts, that is, explicit utterances, from the opinions of speakers and hearers when reasonably relaying messages across language and culture barriers. We need to know, or better assume, that is, form a hypothesis of what is fact or opinion and how the two interact in texts and discourses in terms of their relative importance for the understanding of the text discourse as a whole. Translating or interpreting as acting for others is making what is said by a person understandable to others. And it is therefore an integral part of universal and mediating communication as a practical dimension, as its practical dimension. In addition to the fact that both UC and MC share individual opinions and hypotheses as part of the understanding process, although they use different terms for it, Jaspers calls it ciphers and transcendency. Linguistically, this is termed inferences or implicatures. In mediated communication, we use the term individual hypotheses. In addition to this paradigm, both UC and MC share the concept of identifying three process phases. Jaspers proceeds from first establishing what the partners share in knowledge, empathy, or values, and second, comparing how they differ from one's own, and trying to understand the other, and third, joining and struggling for truth when trying to find true understanding of what the other says by activities like active listening, questioning, raising doubts, opposing, arguing, but always remaining inside oneself, selbst bleiben, in the process. In mediated communication, the three phases go by the names of reception, that is understanding for the purposes of mediating text or discourse, transfer, comparing the relative language and cultural similarities and differences, reproduction, that is the struggle for the right word in context, as is so well exemplified in Goethe's Faust, the first scene, when Faust struggles with the translation for Im Anfang war das Wort, and shifts from in the beginning was the word, in the beginning was the mind, and he finally settles for in the beginning was the act. The interdependence of these three methodological phases is shown in the graph with the well-known MC graph in the center and the correlating Jaspers phases underneath. As you see that here, we go from reception, the text level, to comparison, transfer, linguistic systems level, back again to the reproduction phase, text level. Kampf um die Wahrheit. As an example of these coherence networks, we will show, or Anagorius in 2012 shows a comparison of topic maps, comparing the English translation of Georg Büchner's Lens, and shows that they differ in terms of their text coherence. It is then interesting to note that the variation of the original German alles and its English translation by all, everything, and anything results in a different network picture. That's the first topic map that you see, versus 4 separate networks which are unconnected with each other as islands. The English text requires 3 individual hypotheses to connect the 4 networks with each other, requiring more effort, of course, in the understanding process, possibly involving misunderstandings. This shows how the variation of a word in its contextual continuity may lead to different understandings of the text as a whole due to different individual hypotheses involved in making the islands connect. That is, making a text coherence. Show you this is the completely connected network in German of alles. And you see it is not just one sentence, it's the whole text that is pictured here as a topic map. Versus the English translation, which shows 4 networks, a big one around everything, a small one around all, and then we have 2 other ones which are not connected with each other. And of course, you need to make the individual hypotheses that all 4 are co-referent to all. This is not possible for any other method. So I think that for translation purposes, making your translation work visible to others, trying to visualize and make transparent the hypotheses that go into the text, your individual hypotheses. It is quite telling to use topic maps. As a summary, I would like to say that we have expanded Jasper's universal communication concept to include mediated communication, providing a philosophical basis and global perspective for the theoretical concept of mediated communication and its practical dimension of translation and interpreting. From an overall perspective, this conceptual anchor lets us view translating and interpreting as an indispensable practical tool to avoid or reduce, at least, cultural clashes and political tension through widespread understanding and increased solidarity among people of foreign cultures and language backgrounds and of different value systems. Let me close by saying that TNI, therefore, translating and interpreting, therefore, helps to secure worldwide understanding, tolerance, solidarity, and peace, and is therefore an important subject to be taught at school and other learning institutions. Thank you very much for your interest.